Rome was still young, still uncertain of what it was meant to become. Its first king had been a warrior. Its second would be something entirely different. When Numa Pompilius took the throne, Rome did not conquer new lands, it conquered itself. Numa understood something Romulus had never needed to learn. A city built only on violence would eventually destroy itself. So he turned Rome inward, away from constant war and toward order, ritual, restraint. He gave the Romans gods to fear, ceremonies to obey, and traditions to protect. Where once there had only been soldiers, Numa established priests. Flamines were appointed to serve Jupiter, Mars, and Quirinus, ensuring that even when kings marched to war, the gods would not be forgotten. Virgins were chosen to guard the sacred fire of Vesta, bound to a life of ritual purity, supported by the state itself. Their presence was a reminder. Some duties were older and greater than any single ambition. Sacred brotherhoods marched through the streets in ritual armor, singing ancient hymns, striking their shields in solemn rhythm. These were not displays of power, they were reminders of obligation. Religion was no longer private, it became the foundation of public life. And slowly, something changed. The people who once reached first for weapons began to look upward instead. Faith and custom shaped their behavior as strongly as fear of punishment ever had. Even Rome's enemies noticed the difference. This was no longer just a camp of warriors. It was becoming a city, protected, it seemed, by the favor of the gods themselves. For more than 40 years, Rome knew peace. But peace, like war, shapes the character of a nation. And when Numa died, that balance would be tested. His successor, Tullus Hostilius, was everything Numa was not: young, ambitious, burning with the desire for glory. To Tullus, Rome had grown soft. Peace was not an achievement. It was a weakness. Where Numa had built temples, Tullus sought battlefields, and war soon came, not against distant strangers, but against Rome's own kin. Alba Longa, the ancient mother city, from which Rome itself had sprung, stood across the field. Roman and Alban armies faced one another like family divided by fate. Both claimed justice, both prepared for bloodshed. And yet, before the armies collided, reason intervened. Rather than allow two kindred nations to destroy one another, a single combat was proposed. 3 brothers from Rome against 3 brothers from Alba. The fate of 2 cities would rest on 6 men. The Hieraci and the Curiati stepped forward. When the signal was given, they fought not as individuals, but as living symbols of their nations. Steel clashed, blood fell, 2 Romans died. The Albans rejoiced, but 1 Roman still stood. As his wounded enemies closed in, confident of victory, he turned, drew them apart, and struck them down, one by one. With the final blow, Rome had won dominion. Without the slaughter of armies, it was a victory that would echo for centuries. But triumph has a cost. As the hero returned, carrying the armor of the fallen, his sister recognized among the spoils the cloak of the man she loved. She cried out in grief, and in that moment, personal sorrow collided with public glory. The victor struck her down. Rome fell silent. Justice was demanded. Law was invoked. And yet, faced with the man who had secured Rome's future, the people hesitated. He was spared, not because the act was righteous, but because Rome could not yet afford to condemn its own protector. It was an omen of what Rome would become. The kings who followed built Rome higher, richer, and more powerful. Stone replaced timber. Walls rose where huts once stood. Roads cut through marsh and forest, binding the city to the land around it. Rome expanded, taking new territory, absorbing new peoples, drawing migrants with the promise of protection and opportunity. But with growth came a lesson the Romans would never forget: that when all authority rests in one man, the city itself becomes fragile. Under the later kings, power gathered at the top. Command was absolute. Law was whatever the king declared it to be. Some ruled well, others ruled harshly. And slowly, beneath Rome's rising strength, resentment began to grow. The people fought Rome's wars. They built its roads. They filled its armies. Yet they had no voice. By the time of the last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, fear had replaced consent. He ruled without counsel. He ignored tradition. He silenced opposition. Rome was no longer guided by custom or shared obligation. It was commanded. And then came the act that broke what patience remained. A crime committed not only against a family, but against Roman honor itself. When the outrage became known, the city erupted. The people did not argue. They did not negotiate. They expelled the king. They tore down the monarchy. And they swore an oath that would shape Rome forever. Never again would Rome be ruled by a king. The very word rex became an insult, a warning, a memory of what unchecked power could become. In place of the monarchy, the Romans created something new. Power would no longer belong to one man. It would be divided, limited, temporary. Two consuls would rule together, each able to block the other. Offices would last a single year. No authority would be permanent. Law would stand above individuals. And tradition, mos maiorum, would bind leaders as tightly as subjects. Thus, the Republic was born. Not from idealism, but from fear. Fear of tyranny. Fear of kings. Fear of ever again placing Rome's fate in the hands of one man. But freedom did not bring peace. It brought debate, competition, ambition. Power no longer sat on a throne. It was fought over, contested, and defended. And Rome, now free, would soon discover that a republic could be just as dangerous as a kingdom. The early republic was unstable. Rome now elected its leaders, but those leaders ruled for only a year. Decisions were slower. Authority was divided, and Rome's enemies were watching. To the east and south lived the Volsci, to the north, the Sabines, and in the hills beyond the city, the Aequi. These were not distant empires. They were close, aggressive, patient. They understood one thing clearly: Rome was changing, and change meant weakness. Inside the city, tensions deepened between rich and poor. Soldiers returned from long campaigns to find their farms neglected, their crops ruined, their families in debt. While they had fought for Rome, others had prospered. Arguments filled the forum. Accusations replaced consensus. Political ambition began to outweigh unity. Military discipline suffered. Orders were questioned. Commanders hesitated. Rome was free, but it was divided, and that division would soon be tested. Not in the streets of the city, but in the hills of Mount Algidus. The Aequi struck swiftly. Moving through rugged terrain and wooded passes, they cut into Roman territory and threatened Rome's allies. 2 Roman armies were sent to stop them. Both failed. Trapped in the hills, surrounded by enemy forces, Roman soldiers found themselves on the brink of destruction. Messengers slipped through the lines, carrying a desperate plea back to the city. Rome faced a decision. The Republic's normal processes were too slow. Debate would cost lives. Division would mean defeat. So the Senate turned to an ancient emergency power, one that echoed the authority of kings, but only for a moment. They appointed a dictator, not a tyrant, not a monarch, a single man given absolute authority. For 6 months, or until the crisis passed. The man chosen was Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was not found in the Senate House nor in the Forum. He was found working his own small farm, plowing the earth with his hands. When the envoys delivered the decree, he listened in silence. Then he set down his tools, embraced his family, and followed them to Rome. Power was placed in his hands, and he did not hesitate. Cincinnatus raised an army. He marched without delay. He moved through the night. At Mount Algidus, Roman soldiers, exhausted and surrounded, heard the sound of shields and orders carried on the wind. Relief had arrived. Cincinnatus encircled the Aequi, turning the trap against them. By morning, the enemy was defeated. Rome's armies were freed. Victory was complete. And then, something extraordinary happened. With the war won, Cincinnatus laid down his power. He resigned the dictatorship and returned to his farm. He ruled for days, not months. Rome remembered. The lesson was clear. Extraordinary power could save the Republic, but only if surrendered willingly. Yet even as Rome celebrated, the danger remained. Because every future crisis would raise the same question. What if the next man did not give power back? Rome celebrated Cincinnatus as a hero, not for his victory alone, but for what he refused to become. He had held absolute power, commanded armies, spoken with unquestioned authority, and then he gave it back. To the Romans, this mattered more than triumph. For a moment, the Republic believed it had solved the greatest problem any free state could face: how to survive crisis without surrendering liberty. The dictatorship, they told themselves, was safe, temporary, controlled by tradition, bound by honor. It was a weapon to be used only in emergencies and set aside when danger passed. Mount Algidus became proof, a reminder that one man could save the state and still remain a citizen. But history rarely repeats examples exactly as they are remembered, because what Rome remembered was the power, not the restraint. As generations passed, the Republic grew larger and more strained. Wars lasted longer. Armies stayed in the field for years, not seasons. Commanders gained loyalty not just from the state, but from their soldiers. And each new crisis brought the same argument back to life. We need decisive action. We need unity. We need one man. Dictators were appointed again and again, sometimes wisely, sometimes not. Each time, the boundary shifted. 6 months became a formality. Emergency became a matter of interpretation. Tradition weakened under pressure, and slowly, the lesson of Cincinnatus began to fade, not forgotten, but reinterpreted. Centuries later, Rome would face enemies far greater than the Aequi: civil war, economic collapse, political violence in the streets of the city itself. And once again, Rome would turn to a single man. Lucius Cornelius Sulla took the title of dictator, not to save the Republic, but to remake it by force. His rule had no fixed end. His power was enforced by terror. His enemies were not foreign armies, they were Romans. Sulla eventually stepped down, but the damage was done. Rome had crossed a line. The dictatorship was no longer an emergency tool. It was a prize. And then came Julius Caesar, brilliant, beloved by his soldiers, victorious in war. When crisis came, the Senate offered him the same solution it had offered so many before. Dictator, not for 6 months, not for a year, but for life. The precedent that began at Mount Algidus had reached its final form. What Cincinnatus had taken up and laid down, Caesar accepted and kept. The Republic did not survive the decision. In the end, Rome learned the lesson it had tried so hard to avoid: that no system, no matter how carefully balanced, can protect itself forever from ambition. That power, once granted, always tempts those who hold it, and that Rome's greatest strength, its ability to adapt, was also its greatest danger. Mount Algidus had shown Rome what was possible, but the centuries that followed would show Rome what was inevitable. Rome's story is far from finished. The wars are coming, the legions will march, and next time, we will not look away from the battlefield. If you want to follow Rome's rise step by step, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you're alerted whenever a new episode is released. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Rome's early history should we cover next? Because before Rome ruled the world, it had to fight for its own survival. And that story continues.